With all this talk about the coronavirus, the fact it's unfortunately killing people every day, and a lot of us are having to self-isolate, it got me thinking about disease in boxing, in particular tuberculosis, which was a massive killer around the turn of the 20th century. It was also known as consumption because one of its side effects was to make you lose weight. It took out a lot of boxers and even a few legends, one of whom was born John Edward Kelly, better known as Jack Dempsey. Now, this isn't the Jack Dempsey you're thinking about. This was the original Jack Dempsey, known as the Nonpareil or Nonpareil, which basically meant without equal. This guy could really fight. He was a middleweight and happened to be the first ever middleweight champion under Queensbury rules, although probably not in the sense you're thinking, because he wasn't a fully fledged middleweight. The middleweight limit back then was a little bit lower, so he may have actually been closer to a light middleweight, which just pumps up his pound for pound worth in a historical sense. Now, he was champion from 1884 to 1891, so his fighting prime ran parallel with the great John L. Sullivan. And both those guys, Sullivan a little bit more, but both of them were massive sporting stars of the day, huge. You can try and read little bits of the paper clips and look at old fight reports, but you won't really be able to get a sense of, certainly with the Nonpareil, who's not as famous or hasn't been as preserved, you could say, as Sullivan. It's hard to appreciate how big of a deal this guy would have been. Now, one of his massive caveats, you could say, to his career is that some people think he never really lost on merit. Near the end of his career, he loses twice. Some people think both times he was suffering from the disease which was to kill him. And then another time, he got fouled against an opponent he'd previously beaten, Canadian George LeBlanc. In this 32-rounder, as they're slugging it out, or rather, as the Nonpareil is doing what he was famed for and moving and boxing, he gets hit with this punch known now historically as a pivot punch. It sounds like a frustrated LeBlanc reared back his arm like this and followed through, possibly with the elbow, to knock Dempsey out. It was later considered an illegal punch, and Dempsey got to keep his title. He had previously beaten LeBlanc a few years earlier by a 13-round stoppage when he was probably healthier. Now, Dempsey's style, the way he fought, he probably influenced a lot of people. He fought alongside James J. Corbett as well, who I'm sure studied him. And when I look at the early films of people like a Jim Driscoll, one of the great British Welsh fighters, it sounds like the Nonpareil was one of those real pioneers of the upright style, the left hand, using movement, and fought with a certain neatness, which was probably rare to see in a sport which had more bruises and you were allowed to clinch more, you were allowed to maul more. He used to move around, jab, and apparently ended fights without really shipping much punishment, which says a lot with the liberal rule set back then. Now, he was champ, as I say, from 1884 to 1891. Most of his fights were under Queensbury rules, though he did have a few London prize rules fights, bare knuckle fights, as did John L. Sullivan. So these guys were still predominantly gloved fighters. He eventually lost his title to Bob Fitzsimmons, the great Bob Fitzsimmons. At this point, Dempsey may have already been suffering from early symptoms of TB, and he gets absolutely battered in 13 rounds, floored many times, refuses to quit, and ends up getting punched in the throat, which affected his speech for the remainder of his life. He fought very intermittently until then, 1895, when he was beaten again against the great Tommy Ryan. He dies the same year and gets buried in Portland, Oregon, in the Mount Calvary Cemetery, I believe. I think the original headstone is there. But the interesting point is that apparently John L. Sullivan, along with somebody else, wanted to give the Nonpareil a proper big monument to say, Here lied one of boxing's truly great pugilist specialists. But as the story goes, Dempsey's father-in-law, I don't know at all whether they had a good relationship. Maybe it's just the way he felt it should be, but he said, no, keep your money. We're just going to go for a pretty modest 4-foot headstone. And in a way, you could kind of say that's a microcosm of Dempsey's own legend, because apparently despite how skillful he was, being one of those first real skillful pioneers, he was apparently indifferent to all the praise that was heaped on him during his fighting prime.